Good afternoon, friends. I'm very happy to see you here this afternoon for our research exchange talk that will feature Maggi Kelly. I'm super excited to have her here to make remarks today about her work at the Geospatial Innovation Facility. Before I turn it over to Maggi, I just want to offer a couple of comments and announcements that might be of interest. Today's remarks are co-sponsored by the CITRIS Sustainable Infrastructures Initiative. It's one of the 6 initiatives here at CITRIS, and we always like to highlight a number of the range of initiatives that we have throughout the Research Exchange series. We're in our 10th year of Research Exchange talks, which have presented a number of really exciting developments in technology and the intersection of technology and society on our stage over the last 10 years. All of these are also available on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and check out the archive. There are some really good presentations there. I want to call your attention to 2 upcoming events. One is March 6th, which is the Women in Technology Symposium that is going to be about reimagining cybersecurity for all. So tickets and registration are on sale now. It will be in Sibley Auditorium. That's Friday, March 6th, so take a look at that. And next week, February 26th, the next Research Exchange talk will also feature a UC Berkeley alumna, Jen Schrady, who now has an academic appointment in France, and she'll be talking about a new book that she has out around social media and political activism that I think you'll find quite engaging and timely. So Maggi Kelly is professor and cooperative extension specialist in the Environmental Science Policy and Management Department and an affiliated professor of geography here at UC Berkeley. Her group uses a range of geospatial data and analytics. Listen to this list of keywords, all of which I find super exciting, including spatial modeling, remote sensing, drones, Lidar, historical archives, surveys, participatory mapping, and fieldwork, to gain insights about how and why California landscapes are changing and what that change means for those who live on, use, and manage our lands. Her work enables interdisciplinary collaboration, data-rich analytics research, and active outreach and significant societal impact across a number of scientific domains, including forestry, agriculture, wetlands, and climate change. So I'm delighted to have you here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Maggi Kelly.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm not in charge of my mic, so is it on? Can you hear it in the back? Awesome, great. Okay, well thanks everybody for coming. I'm very excited to meet you all and talk about some of the work we've been doing in my lab at UC Berkeley and through my group at the UC Division of Ag and Natural Resources. So I'm going to talk kind of broadly about some of the mapping work we've done, and as you heard before, mapping to me is a very broad concept. But at the root of everything, the challenges that we're facing today around food, around water, energy, equity, invasive species, fire, climate change, the environment, conservation, these are all really complex, thorny problems. They require a spatial approach, and they impact diverse public groups. So the fields that I'm involved in academically, geography and ecology, as well as these kind of translational disciplines like disaster response or natural resource management or planning, all this work always starts with a map. But maps have been changing quite dramatically in the last few decades, even more so. We've got new data streams from things like your phone or from APIs on the web or from satellites and sensors. We've got new advances in computing, advances in database integration, in sharing, and a pursuit of reproducibility. Tools like our analytics and machine learning, cluster computing, all these sorts of things mean our technological landscape is changing, but at the same time, there's a much more public focus on geography. We no longer have to sort of ask, do any of you know what a GIS is? We're all using maps every day on our phone. That means the scales of interest are not only more global, we're able to get the globe in our hand easily, but they're also much more intensely personal before. And I think that means that this technological spatial landscape that we all do work in is much more relevant than ever, and that means that we've got much more chances to collaborate and cross cross bridges. So to me, when I say everything starts with a map, maps to me are data, they're tools, and they're the people that bring them together. And so the data that we work with, that's a little preview. The data that we work with comes from GIS databases, it comes from sensors, remote sensing. We can talk about participatory and crowdsourced data. We get data from the field, we get data from UAVs and drones. Tools are expanding really quickly, new ways to aggregate data and make sense of these disparate data sets together, powerful analytical tools to pull them together. We're now able to look at space and time together. We can distribute our computation across platforms to make it more powerful, and we can create really powerful web mapping and visualization resources for people to understand these data and make sense of them and use them in things like adaptation or in everyday life. And these sort of data and tools, this data and tool landscape can be proprietary, meaning it's created by a software company, it might charge a fee, or it can be open. But all of these are linked together by the people who are using the data, who are collaborating across platforms, who are providing engagement opportunities, and at the end of the day, making an impact. So that's what maps mean to me. This is the new definition of a map. It's pretty broad. And so I thought I'd illustrate this new, not very new, but somewhat new definition of maps with 3 projects of mine. So I'm going to talk about historical data and some of the work we've done diving into the archives and digitizing dark data and bringing it to light. And then a much more modern data set, also looking at forest structure, called Lidar, light detection and ranging. And then we'll conclude with some fun new stuff we're working on with drones and UAV imagery. And in each of these case studies, I'll illustrate this sort of data, people, tools triad that bring all these things together. So the first case asks us to think back and to think about the forest structure in California, say 100 years ago, or at least decades ago. And we've been using historical data archives to get at forest structure change in California through time. We've been asking questions like, we see the changes happening, how can we explain this? Is it a climate change phenomenon? Is it something else? Is it just management? And I call your attention to this. This is a photo taken in the 1920s by the lead in this data set I'm going to tell you about, Albert Wieslander. This is an example of forests in California in the 1920s, and I draw your attention to the human there, which is, so these forests were very big and had a lot of gaps between the trees. You've heard this message before, but maybe not from this particular angle. So it's true that detailed records of past agricultural, ecological, and climate conditions exist throughout the state. They exist in paper archives, in historical imagery, in biological specimens, and in maps. And sometimes we don't know about these. They're in drawers, they're hidden away, but we can make use of them. And the example that I want to talk to you about today is this one that I've devoted just a little bit over a decade on. This is the California Vegetation Type Mapping Collection, spearheaded by this gentleman here, Albert Wieslander, graduate of Cal Agricultural College in 1914, also was the spearhead for beginning Cal Forestry in 1914, so really the beginning of what sort of became Cal Forestry, and also was a Forest Service employee. So he spearheaded this work throughout the state with crews under the direction of this man, Albert Wieslander, in the 1920s and 30s. They drew vegetation maps showing the dominant vegetation class. They took samples, they took herbarium specimens, they also detailed information at a number of plots. They took gorgeous photos. And in all cases, they created maps. They created maps of the vegetation class. They also provided maps of where the plots were. They provided maps of where they took vegetation. And all told, this vegetation collection is really considered to be one of the finest ever made in the Western Hemisphere. It's the kind of core origin of all the other mapping projects that have gone in the West and indeed in the United States. So the collection itself consists of these gorgeous vegetation maps, plot data on cards that detail information about the overstory and the understory and the size class and the species and of the vegetation there. The plot maps show where the plots were taken. The photographs are really quite astonishing, and the herbarium specimens, and we've spent a lot of time bringing all of these things back together, and they're now all here in analog form at the library, which is a fantastic feat. But what my lab and several other labs, including Jim Thorne up at Davis, have been doing is digitizing all of these data. So we've digitized. Jim Thorne, his lab was responsible for all the vegetation maps, incredibly detailed work, delineating the outline of each polygon. My lab was in charge of the plot data and the plot maps, and the library was in charge of bringing together the photos and the specimens. So we pulled all these things into a geographic information system. That map on the right just sort of shows the density of where we have data throughout the state. So a lot in the Sierra, a lot in the south central coast. And these are really important bits of information about the vegetation that was in California in the 20s and 30s. And so we can start to ask questions. What did the forest look like in the 20s and 30s, and what does it look like now? This pair of photos is not from Wieslander, but you get the idea. So we can take the plot data from the VTM project and the plot data from the Forest Service plots and just look at changes in forest structure. And so we've done this a number of ways throughout California, and the results are extremely clear. Forests in the 30s were big. They had gaps between them. They were like that picture you saw at the beginning. Forests in the 2000s have much fewer big trees. They have much more small trees, many more small trees, and smaller biomass overall. So those three changes are really, really clear when you look at the comparison between these two data sets. Fewer big trees, more small trees, denser forests, and less biomass overall. So then we start to ask questions like, well, why is that? What's the reason that these changes are happening? And this first paper that we published showed that the best explanatory factor was this thing called climate water deficit. And this just meant that where these big trees were declining and the little trees were growing in and the biomass was changing, we also had an increase in this climate water deficit. And this is water in the soil that plants can make use of. And we found this statewide. It was a really significant, statistically significant finding, and we published it. We got a lot of buzz, but we also got a lot of criticism. And people said, it's not climate, it's just management. They were out surveying big trees. They were all foresters, so of course they love big trees. So you have to look at you have to look at management. You got to look at logging signal, and you've got to look at fire. And so we thought that's fair enough, makes sense. So we redid this whole analysis, but looked at it on each of these different kind of management types, from national park to private protected, through wilderness, through private timberland, guessing that if management had a huge signal, then this would translate across this analysis if we broke it out by management unit. But indeed it does not. It's really consistent across the state. So the changes in small trees, the changes in large trees, and the changes in biomass are really consistent across the state, across management unit. And in fact, these two very differently managed management regimes, national parks and wilderness and private timberlands actually had some very corresponding signals in what was happening to their forests. So it was an interesting case and a kind of a cautionary tale that these analog data need to be brought to light. And so this diagram here is by a former grad student of mine, Kelly Easterday. She was thinking about ways that we take these archives that are dark. They might be in file cabinets. They might be distributed through libraries and not easily findable. And we want to bring those data into the open. And there's a new thinking process around this called FAIR, making data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and usable. And this is sort of the gold standard. How do we bring data into light so that it can be reusable in ways that I just showed you? So the take home for this first case study is that spatial data is everywhere. It's more detailed than ever before. It's more broad than ever before. We have an incredible continuity. We can focus on new things. But I like this case study because it tells us something about data resilience. And resilience isn't a word that's often used when you think about data, but it's really what we're aiming for. We want to make these data resilient so they can be used elsewhere, and maybe not necessarily for the purpose they were gathered, but always for the for the utility of society. So the second case study is also looking at forest structure. It's a little bit more focused. It's not statewide. And here we were interested in more recent times. We're interested in everything from the 2000s on. And the research questions are looking at how has forest structure changed through time, and how can we manage forests in the face of uncertainty in terms of climate, and in particular, how do fuel treatments impact forest function? So this whole next project is highlights some work we did with the Forest Service and many other public stakeholders looking at forest structure in a more detailed way. And the impetus for all of it was what happens when the Forest Service, because we have denser forests, we know this from the study I just showed you, but we also know it very much more broadly. What happens when the Forest Service takes that fuel out of the forest? What is the impact on wildlife, the impact on water, and the impact on fire? And the background picture is an example of all of us in the forest, in the Sierra, looking at, on the right-hand side, Forest Service fuel treatment, and on the left-hand side, of untreated forest. It's much denser, but you can see on the right-hand side, the forest looks a little bit impacted. And it does. These fuel treatments that the Forest Service and others are putting in place to reduce that fuel burden are quite impactful. So we have here an example of a typical fuel treatment. They're removing trees of a certain DBH or diameter at breast height or size. They're removing those that fuel out of the forest so that if a fire comes, it'll burn in a way that it used to burn, say 100 years ago. But these fuel treatments can be quite controversial because they are so impactful. So our group was brought in as a very broad coalition of scientists and stakeholders and Forest Service to sort of really investigate what was happening with these fuel treatments. And my team was involved in measuring those impacts to the forest, measuring forest structure, not with these archives that I told you about before, but with something called Lidar, light detection and ranging. This is an example of a Lidar instrument on a UAV drone. This is more modern. We used a Lidar instrument like this on an aircraft, but the same principle holds. It's an active remote sensing technology. It uses something like this laser pointer to emit light, and the time between when that pulse of light is emitted and bounced off of a target and comes back, because we know the speed of light, we know how far away the target is. It's a really particularly useful technology. So you get results like this. This is raw data. This is just a Lidar point cloud. It's color coded by height above ground. And each of these individual dots is a return. And I'll just kind of cruise you through it. You can, map forests in their entirety. And this is, again, this is not analyzed data, this is raw data where each point is a return from this instrument that was flying above it. And you can intuitively see how you can start to get at structure really, really clearly. A still of this kind of point cloud reveals here, you can get the trees, but you can also get the forest floor. This is looking at downed trees after a fire on the forest ground. These are things that you couldn't necessarily see if you were flying over or using an optical camera that used reflected light. And the reason is that this LiDAR can penetrate through the forest, because when you're looking at plants, you get a return back from a leaf, but you get a little bit more of that signal goes farther. So you get more than one return from each initial pulse, which means you can really penetrate into the forest and get structure. So if you pull out a stand of trees like this, because you've got that top of the tree to bottom of the ground data set, you can pull out all sorts of pieces of information about each individual tree. First thing, you can separate or segment this cloud into all these individual trees, and from each individual tree, you can measure where its location, its height, its crown size. In some cases, you can get canopy base height, which is a tremendously important one for fire. That's how far above the ground does the green stuff start. You can get the crown shape, you can get the volume, and because you can put all these digital trees back together again into the forest, you can get things like stand density or forest density, or what's the spacing between the trees, or what's the pattern of the trees, and all these things yield important information for us in terms of how the forest is functioning. And we can do all this through time. So this is another snapshot of a LiDAR point cloud. Here on the left, this is pre-Forest Service treatment, and this is post-Forest Service treatment. And so this is a way to directly measure the volume in these forests that can be removed when you do treatment. We can also put these data into things like fire behavior modeling. And so we can say, given this forest given this stand or this forest without the treatment, how will it burn compared to with the treatment? So tremendously detailed information from this LiDAR, light detection and ranging technology. We get detailed mapping. We can do work looking at wildlife habitat, and that was some of the work we did on these forest fuel treatments to see how they impacted various species. Key ecological components of forests, like the vertical structure, things like ladder fuels. These are the fuels that lead a fire up into the crown and make a fire much more catastrophic. Large tree density. We can get canopy-related measures. And then some other work that we've been doing with Scott Stevens' lab at Berkeley is using these as inputs to fire behavior modeling. So LiDAR can be directly, or the products from LiDAR can be directly used to help us get a very fine, detailed map of the way a fire might move through the forest. We can also get structural change, as I mentioned before, things like biomass. And increasingly, we're talking about, doing mapping at the plant scale, at the tree scale, and at the stand scale, and at the forest scale. But with these technology, we're also talking about now doing mapping at the leaf scale, or what's the structure within a tree. And this is particularly exciting, and makes use of a couple of different advances in LiDAR that I'll showcase here. The first is mobile LiDAR. So all the stuff I showed you before was on an aircraft or a UAV, but you can also put that same sensor on a backpack and walk around. And so anybody guess what this building is? Yeah. So we just walked around there. So you get, you could use this in mobile mapping. This is used in cars for lots of mapping of urban spaces. This is the eucalyptus grove by our home down in Mulford. So this is it in just taking a picture, and this is it as you walk through it with one of these backpacks. But each of these trees now, instead of just being a picture, it's measurable. You could, virtually slice it at DBH and measure its biomass. You can do all sorts of work with that kind of detail. And increasingly, we're using these sorts of things in what's called terrestrial LiDAR. So it's no longer in your backpack, it's on a tripod. And what we're actually looking at is the leaf scale changes in one plant through a growing season. So this is helping with thinking about phenotyping different agricultural crops, or just understanding the ways in which plants change through time and how that might be correlated with other factors that we can gather from field sensors and remote sensing. So, down to the really, really tiny, and then I just got to put a shout out for up to the really, really big, because we now have our first operational LiDAR system orbiting the Earth in this wonderful instrument called JEDI. It comes out of, it's managed by University of Maryland and NASA Goddard, and the PI of it, Ralph Dubai, he's a big Star Wars fan, so he called it JEDI, and they're the Jedi Knights, which is awesome. But so this is on the space station right now. It's kind of in testing to see if we should be putting one in orbit, but we'll be able to get that kind of detailed information about our globe's forests soon, which is tremendously exciting. And so that's hilarious. That's a phone call for me that I will decline. So the message about the LiDAR case study is LiDAR is one of these examples that's just now emerging out of this kind of custom niche workflow domain. There's a lot of very specific software packages that do very specific things, but we are starting to move into the arena where you can process your LiDAR data in the cloud with Jupyter Notebooks and R. There's more packages coming out every day. So other aspects of GIS have made this transition earlier, but with LiDAR, we're just on the cusp, and it's an exciting movement that we all encourage. So the third case study that I want to show you is about UAVs, and this is the one that I've been spending a little bit more time on recently, and it all has to do with vegetation management using UAVs or drones. And we've been working on projects throughout California, and they all have to do with things like can we sense from cameras on UAVs changes in plant water stress, what sort of plant characteristics, structural characteristics can we map using UAV imagery? And then we're also doing some work looking at post-fire recovery up at Hopland using these highly detailed RGB and multispectral images. And these are just some snapshots. This is from Hopland, this is from Russell Ranch, and this is from the Mojave Desert. But the thing about UAVs or drones is they're kind of being a real game changer in the remote sensing world, because they offer you both flexible and precise data. They have fine spatial resolution, and you decide as the user when you want to fly and how you want to fly. The costs can be very reasonable. The flight can be controlled. The camera or the sensor can be controlled by the user. And the products can be, there are very many products that we can develop out of this imagery, and they're very engaging hands-on technology. So my most recent work focuses on, like I say, we've been doing some plant water limitation and spectral response at Bohr, which is the Blue Oak Reserve just down the way. We've also been, as I said, doing some post-fire monitoring up in Hopland, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about these, some of the agricultural work at a place called Lynn Cove, which is a UCA&R Research and Extension Center in the Central Valley. It's a small-ish research center. It primarily hosts experiments and work focusing on citrus varietals, but there are a few other crops grown there, pomegranates and olives. But it's flat-ish, but it's complex in terms of the vegetation. Lots of different sizes, lots of different varieties, lots of different ages, and so it's not as complicated as a forest by any means, but it's not a simple agricultural field that we're trying to get information out of. So when you're gathering information about like an agricultural crop to make actionable management decisions, like where am I going to irrigate, where am I going to amend, what might yield be coming up, you can break this down again, as I've mentioned before, and think about it through scale. You can think about, I want to be able to pull information about individual leaves or the stem or the fruit. And you can think about how many of these are there, what's the size, what's the condition, what's the structure. And believe it or not, there are work using UAVs to get at mapping things like individual fruit and what's the condition of fruit on the tree. Where we normally work is sort of at the plant scale. What's the location? What's the count? What's the size? What's the condition of that plant? What's the structure of that plant? Or if you want to move out and think about at the scale of a crop or a field, or in forestry, the canopy, we can think about what's the extent, what's the cover, what's the type, what's the composition, what's its condition, what's its structure, what's its pattern. Or if you want to think about more broadly your entire site, how big is it? What's its cover? What's its composition? These sorts of things are all available through remote sensing. Some of them, when you're talking about UAVs, some of them take advantage of the spectral information that the camera is capable of, and some of them take advantage of what's called the point cloud, and that's this almost Lidar-like data set that you get because you're taking a picture of the same thing from multiple vantage points. And so we've been doing work at Lynn Cove for a while. We've flown it a number of times. This is a fixed-wing UAV called an EB, and it flies. It's fast. It's steady. It's great. It takes really good imagery. We fly it with a Parrot Sequoia multispectral camera. This is just an example of a field showing the kind of variety of varietals that we have here. They're on different rootstocks. They might be have different amendments given, but some of the tasks that we want to do is how do we pull that information I showed you in the last slide out? And so I've been partnering with this company called Aerobotics. They are an agricultural subscription service that does some interesting stuff, and I wanted to see what it was that they were working on. So from that EB that we flew last September, you can get information like the digital surface model, which is just the height of all of these trees. You can get, segment or pull out the feature from the individual image, like I showed you before. How many trees are there? What are their size? You can get information about what's their spacing between rows or between plants. You can get overall canopy cover for your field. And from this 3D structure that I was telling you about, this point cloud, you can get at the volume. How big are these trees? And it's very similar to what I showed you before with the Lidar work. But you can also get some very interesting information out of the spectral response of these plants. So the graph there is a spectral reflectance curve. It's just showing you how across the electromagnetic spectrum, how a typical plant or green leaf would interact with light. There's a little bit of a peak in the green. There's a dip in the blue and the red where the leaf is using that energy for photosynthesis. And then there's a big reflection in the near infrared. It's longer wavelength. We can't see it, but that transition between the absorption in the red and the reflectance in the near infrared is called the red edge. And we now make cameras that are sensitive in all of those portions of the spectrum. And this is the one we use, the Parrot Sequoia. So it's got a camera that's sensitive to each of those portions of the spectrum. So if we go back to our, pardon me, I'm getting a message. If we go back to our field here, we can start to tell something about what's going on in the plant itself, not just the structure of the plant, but what's going on in terms of moisture content or health level. This is just a shot of NDVI, normalized difference vegetation index. It takes advantage of that red and that near infrared light, and it tells us something about health and moisture. And there's a second index called normalized difference red edge that takes advantage of that sort of transition zone in the spectrum. And this is just the whole field, and these are just each individual tree, what's its average index. And you can start to see how all of these plots have a real edge problem. So these trees on the edge are, even though they look the same to us visually, they might have the same structure, et cetera, but they're struggling a little bit with their proximity to the drying road that goes between them. So you can start to think about how do we want to plan our amendments to answer that. The final thing we did at this project, which is kind of cool, is we did walk this field with that backpack unit I showed you before to really get down to this leaf scale mapping of each of these individual trees. So where the Lidar data I showed you before from the Sierra, you might get 10 of these dots per square meter. With these terrestrial and mobile Lidar, you might get 1,000 or 10,000 hits per square meter. Extremely dense data, very useful if you want to find out in very detail what's happening with the shape of that tree and how the shape of that tree changes through time. So UAVs, drones are an exciting avenue. We're all working on them. Processing-wise, it's again this kind of transition I mentioned before with the Lidar, where we're pulling ourselves slowly out of working at the desktop to working in the cloud and trying to develop open and transparent and reproducible workflows that result in shared databases, better processing, actionable data, and then increased collaboration. And to that end, I did mention at the beginning how UAVs and drones are kind of they're a nice STEM tool for starting to teach about computer science or agricultural ecology. And we do a lot of this through my work at the University of California Ag and Natural Resources. This is Sean Hogan here giving a public outreach demonstration about UAVs in agriculture. And we do this a lot. This is from one of our recent drone camps. Anyway, on the left-hand side, this is a cautionary tale. This guy got a new drone for Christmas, went out, flew it the first time, and almost cut his fingers off because he turned it on while he had his hands near the propeller, so don't do that. I've never even thought about doing that, but this is a kick. So this is from somebody in one of our drone camp workshops sent us. We do a lot of manual takeoff and landing practice, and she sent us her heart rate monitor from the time that she was on the controls, which was quite a lovely gift to get. This is not her, but this is another one of our campers at our annual drone camp doing this practicing of takeoff and landing. So we do this every year. And here's some snapshots from last year's drone camp at Monterey. So if any of you out there are interested in paying or getting more into using drones for research, I encourage you to chat with me about it. Like I say, we're going to do it in June. It'll be in Monterey County, and we go through flight skills, safety and regs, hardware, software, data collection, analysis, that sort of stuff. So we've talked about data, we've talked about tools. It's time to talk about people. UAVs are great for this. Collaboration is critical and useful in all the work we do. We've got to find bridges between scientists, public, policymakers, industry, lab, land managers. It's fundamentally critical that we do this as we move forward in the 21st century, and maps are integrators. They are the core to all of this. They're core to starting the conversation, and they're core to keeping that conversation going. And yeah, I say here, mapping makes exchanges between groups easier and more powerful. So to sort of wrap all of this up, I think whatever you're working in, successful natural resource management, but you pick the field. It always starts with a map. By maps, we're talking about data, we're talking about tools, and we're talking about collaboration. And these are my three things that I'm into right now. I'm interested in resilient data, I'm interested in reproducible tools, and I'm interested in building collaborations or bridges between parties. So thanks a lot. I'm going to leave this slide up. I just want to point out, here's some resources for you if you're interested in more workshops on campus. I'm the faculty director of the GIFT down in Mulford Hall. There are also a lot of other workshops out there, the D-Lab for one, but this is just what I'm involved in. If you're interested in workshops throughout the state, my group through UCA&R, Informatics and GIS, we hold workshops throughout the state, and we're the ones who put on this drone camp every year. And then I also have office hours on campus in Mulford Hall if you're interested in chatting. So thanks very much for your attention, and I'd love to take some questions.
We do have 2 microphones in the back. If you have questions, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you.
Great talk, Maggie. So I was just wondering, you were, I know that Lidar and all of these technologies are oriented towards light data, the visual data. I'm just wondering, is there anything that can pick up chemical data? If you're looking at plant stress, if you can pick up, any kind of stress response in the plant or water response, or if there's anything that can pick up those kinds of signals.
Yeah, it's a great question. So all of the stuff I have talked about is to do with, sensing using light. We also have UAVs equipped with thermal cameras, so you can get something about leaf response to water stress from thermal cameras through the day and through the growing season, but that's still sort of in the imagery domain. But there are some very interesting, there are sensors that can pick up, that are sensitive to chemical stressors. It's a much more plant-based sensing. You'd have to, equip an individual plant. So it's possible at smaller scale. There's some neat work going on right now using UAVs to capture sort of with a sensor on the UAV to fly through things like smoke plumes to find out where different particulates are concentrated as the fire is increasing or decreasing. And so you could imagine doing something like that around a plant or forest. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, you could probably do a lot. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how to express this, but when I was looking at the Lidar,
Yeah.
And you were showing we were kind of able to, it was almost like a short video, or you could sort of change the angle and go a little bit deeper. And you had also referenced a photograph of that same forest, and I was thinking, is there any usefulness, or are you talking about how to integrate or maybe combine the photographic type resolution with Lidar so that can be a type of experience for the data?
Beautiful. It's so true. So that is an immersive experience, but it's kind of on the research side. But in the viz world, you're exactly right. So there's a lot of research on pairing the structure you get from Lidar with optical imagery that you're taking from a camera to create this kind of immersive walkthrough. And some people, I've talked about these forest treatment stuff. Some scientists are doing, let's show what this forest might look like pre and post treatment. But of course, these kinds of things are all very familiar to gamers. That's how we start to create these gaming worlds. And but on the research side, not the gaming side, but the research side, there's a lot to be gotten from the melding of the spectral information from an optical camera with the structural information from Lidar. So you can start to pull those things together, because the Lidar itself, you can tell something about species if you're distinguishing, say, between a conifer and a hardwood, but you got to get the spectral information to really pull out species in those two classes. So you're right on, and there's a lot of applications for the fusion of those two types of data. So great question.
So the U.S. Geological Survey's been using drones for a while for Lidar and some other things. And I know they've been talking about using magnetic tomography for looking at mineral resources. Are you thinking about using MT for water concentrations and other possibilities? The other question I had, which is unrelated, but I'm just curious your opinion. Supposedly Google and Apple are working on a highly restrictive new law relating to drones that's going to Congress in a couple of months. And I'm curious if that would affect your research.
So the first part on the tomography, I'm not involved in that, but I know a lot of researchers are. It's, kind of cracking this nut about where do we have reserves of water and groundwater and how they're being used. So it's absolutely important, and there's lots of technologies that are being used for that, but I'm not an expert in it and I don't use it. The second question, I don't know anything about Google and Apple pushing a law to restrict drones to Congress. I would be very interested to know more about that. I am on a UC-wide panel committee for drone safety and research, and that topic has not come up yet. We are talking about a lot of things. How do we make better use of drones, or can we make better use of drones flying over campuses? How do we do that safely? UC San Diego is right now they're pioneering a test case of delivery of medical samples back and forth between hospitals. So we know about these things. I don't know about this. So if you want to or care to, I'd be happy to get an email and you could tell me more and I'd dig into it.
What are some of the current obstacles to making good forest fire models, and how does this data help overcome those obstacles?
That's a great question. So the forest, and there's lots of ways to answer it. So the forest fire models that we use are broad in scale, and they sort of assume kind of a big resolution. And they don't do a great job of moving fire up into the canopy. And I'll tell you, the thing that's kind of blows my mind is the detail from the Lidar stuff was almost too much for some of the models to handle. So we almost had to down sample it to make it more useful for those fire models. But if you talk to somebody like Mark Finney, who's our master on all the fire behavior modeling, they're always thinking about changing these things to get better understanding of how fire can move through an individual tree canopy and then scale that up to the forest. So I don't think there's a data limitation anymore, whereas there might have been 20 years ago. Now it's the model is lagging behind the data that we have that can to serve it. But great question. Yeah. Scott Stevens might also have an answer or two for that one. So, yeah.
Have you had a chance to collaborate with any journalists? There's some pretty interesting stuff I've been seeing coming out that uses sensor data to, create sort of interactive stories and stuff. Is that?
Yeah. No, the only collaboration we've done with journalists is around a research result, or a paper gets published and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But
do you have the same geographical areas covered over sort of multiple years, so you could look at differences over time?
that's the goal, and we
Yeah.
don't have it for all areas, but some of them will have a before and after, say a fire. But the idea is to get these deep stacks of data, which is what some we're trying to get with satellite remote sensing imagery, and to be able to mine them through time to really understand change at a much higher temporal resolution. That's absolutely what we're working on. Yeah, so I'd love to chat with you more.
Okay. Thank you everybody for coming.
Yes, thank you all.